June 5, 1944. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in a room at Southwick House near Portsmouth, England, facing the most consequential decision of World War II. Outside, a violent storm battered the English Channel. Before him sat his senior commanders, meteorologists and staff officers, all waiting for his answer to a single question: should the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France proceed as planned, or should it be postponed? The fate of the free world hung in the balance. This is the story of the decision Eisenhower made that saved D-Day. To understand the magnitude of Eisenhower's decision, we must first appreciate what was at stake. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allied invasion of Normandy, was the largest amphibious military operation in history. More than 150,000 Allied troops would storm 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. Supporting them would be nearly 7,000 ships and landing craft, 11,000 aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of personnel in England preparing to follow the initial assault waves. The planning had taken years. The stakes could not have been higher. If the invasion succeeded, it would open a second front against Nazi Germany, relieving pressure on the Soviet Union in the east and beginning the liberation of Western Europe. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would be killed or captured. The invasion could not be attempted again for months, perhaps a year. German morale would soar. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union might fracture. Adolf Hitler would have time to perfect his V-weapons, and perhaps even develop atomic weapons. The entire course of the war, and indeed of history, depended on the success of this single operation. Eisenhower had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December 1943. A career military officer from Kansas, Eisenhower was not the most obvious choice for such a position. He had never commanded troops in combat. He was junior to many British officers, including Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would command all ground forces during the initial phases of the invasion. But Eisenhower possessed qualities that made him uniquely suited for this role: diplomatic skill, an ability to forge consensus among strong-willed subordinates, unflappable temperament, and willingness to accept ultimate responsibility. These qualities would all be tested in early June 1944. The original date selected for D-Day was June 5, 1944. This date was not chosen arbitrarily. The invasion required specific conditions that occurred only on a few days each month. First, the assault needed to begin shortly after dawn to allow aircraft and naval guns to bombard German defenses, while giving troops enough daylight to fight inland. Second, the tide needed to be low enough to expose German beach obstacles so engineers could destroy them, but rising so that landing craft could quickly unload and retract. Third, a late rising moon was needed the night before to help paratroopers and glider troops landing behind enemy lines. These conditions aligned perfectly on June 5, 6, and 7. After that, the next opportunity would not come for 2 weeks. But there was another factor no one could control: the weather. The English Channel is notoriously unpredictable, with storms arising quickly and waves that can make amphibious landings impossible. Cloud cover could blind pilots and prevent accurate bombing. High winds could scatter paratroopers far from their drop zones. Rough seas could swamp landing craft and make soldiers violently seasick before they even reached the beach, reducing their combat effectiveness. From the beginning, everyone knew that weather would be crucial. What no one anticipated was just how difficult the weather would make Eisenhower's decision. As June approached, Eisenhower assembled his meteorological team. The chief forecaster was Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force, a Scottish meteorologist who had been carefully monitoring Atlantic weather patterns for months. Assisting him were teams of British and American weathermen who sometimes disagreed in their predictions. This was before satellite imagery, before computer modeling, before any of the sophisticated tools modern meteorologists take for granted. Weather forecasting in 1944 relied on reports from ships at sea, weather stations, and the trained intuition of experienced forecasters reading barometric pressure, wind patterns, and cloud formations. By late May, everything was in motion. Thousands of ships had gathered in ports along the southern English coast. Troops were sealed in their embarkation areas, cut off from the outside world to maintain security. Many had been given French currency and had been briefed on their objectives. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were ready. The British 6th Airborne Division was prepared to seize crucial bridges and eliminate coastal batteries. Montgomery's ground forces were poised to strike. The invasion fleet was so vast that German reconnaissance aircraft could hardly miss it once it set sail. Secrecy depended on the Germans not knowing where or when the blow would fall. The Germans, for their part, were expecting an invasion but remained uncertain about its location. Hitler and many of his generals believed the attack would come at the Pass de Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel and the most direct route to Germany. This belief had been reinforced by an elaborate Allied deception operation called Fortitude, which used fake radio traffic, dummy tanks and aircraft, and double agents to convince the Germans that a massive army group under General George Patton was preparing to strike at Calais. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German forces along the Atlantic Wall, disagreed. He believed Normandy was a likely target and had worked frantically to strengthen its defences, planting millions of mines and obstacles. On June 1st, Eisenhower met with his senior commanders at Southwick House. The weather forecast was troubling. Stagge reported that a low-pressure system was moving in from the Atlantic, bringing clouds, rain and rough seas. The conditions on June 5th would be marginal at best. Eisenhower polled his commanders. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding the naval forces, said the Navy could manage but expressed concern about landing craft in heavy seas. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory, commanding the air forces, was more pessimistic, warning that cloud cover could severely limit air support and that the paratroop drops might be disastrous. Montgomery, characteristically confident, wanted to proceed. Eisenhower listened carefully, his face betraying little emotion, then said they would meet again the following day. June 2nd and 3 brought no improvement. The weather worsened. Stagge's forecasts grew increasingly grim. On the evening of June 3rd, Eisenhower held another conference. The storm was building. Rain lashed the windows of Southwick House. Stagge presented his forecast. June 5th would see low clouds, high winds, and rough seas. Conditions would be poor for both air and naval operations. The question was unavoidable: should they proceed or postpone? Eisenhower faced an agonizing dilemma. If he postponed now, the entire invasion fleet would have to be recalled. Some ships had already sailed. Tens of thousands of seasick troops would have to be brought back to port, disembarked, and held for another attempt. The longer the delay, the greater the chance that German intelligence would discover the plan. Security could not be maintained indefinitely with so many men knowing the secret. There was also the question of morale. The troops were keyed up, ready to go. Postponement could undermine their confidence and fighting spirit. And then there was the political dimension. Stalin was demanding the second front. Any delay would strain the alliance. On the other hand, launching the invasion into a storm could be disastrous. Landing craft might be swamped. Paratroopers could be scattered across the countryside, unable to complete their missions. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment would be inaccurate or impossible. Soldiers arriving on the beaches would be cold, wet, exhausted, and seasick, facing German defenders firing from prepared positions. The amphibious tanks, the D.D. Shermans designed to swim ashore and provide fire support, might sink in rough seas. The entire operation could collapse into a bloody shambles on the beaches of Normandy. Eisenhower had written a message accepting full responsibility in case the invasion failed. He carried it in his wallet. After listening to his commanders, Eisenhower made his first crucial decision. He postponed D-Day by 24 hours from June 5th to June 6th. It was the only prudent choice given the forecast, but it was also an agonizing one. Ships already at sea had to be recalled. The airborne forces, some of whose aircraft were already warming up on runways, stood down. The tension was unbearable. Everyone knew they could not wait long. If June 6th was impossible, The only option would be June 7th. After that, the tides would be wrong, and they would have to wait 2 weeks. 2 weeks was unthinkable. The evening of June 4th was miserable. Rain poured down, wind howled. The invasion fleet was scattered in ports and anchorages. Waiting at Southwick House, Eisenhower paced. He smoked cigarette after cigarette. He was a chain smoker, going through several packs a day under stress. His chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, later recalled that Eisenhower looked 10 years older that night. The weight of command sat heavily on his shoulders. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the commanders and staff officers waited for the next weather briefing, scheduled for 9:30 p.m. At 9:30 p.m. on June 4th, Group Captain Stagg entered the room. All eyes turned to him. Eisenhower asked simply, "What do you have for us, Stagg?" What Stagg said next would change everything. The forecast had shifted. The storm battering England was indeed severe, but Stagg's team had detected a gap in the weather. A high-pressure ridge was moving in behind the low-pressure system. It would bring a brief window of improved conditions on June 6th. The improvement would not be dramatic. Conditions would still be far from ideal, but they would be marginally better. Cloud cover would break somewhat, allowing air operations. Winds would decrease slightly. The seas would remain rough, but perhaps manageable. The window would be narrow, lasting perhaps 36 hours before another storm system moved in. Stagg could not guarantee his forecast. Weather prediction was not an exact science. The American meteorologists on his team were more pessimistic, believing conditions would remain poor. But Stagg, trusting his reading of the data and his experience, believed the window would materialize. Eisenhower questioned him closely. How confident was he? What were the risks? Stagg answered honestly. He was moderately confident, but there were no certainties. The room fell silent. Eisenhower turned to his commanders. Admiral Ramsay spoke first. The Navy could manage, he said, though it would be difficult. Sailors would be exhausted, and there would be losses. But the fleet could get the troops to Normandy. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory remained pessimistic. He feared heavy losses among the paratroopers, and doubted that air support would be effective. He recommended postponement. Montgomery disagreed. Monty wanted to go. He believed the troops were ready, that surprise remained intact, and that the Germans would not expect an attack in poor weather. Delay was more dangerous than risk. General Smith agreed with Montgomery. So did most of the others. But the decision, everyone knew, was Eisenhower's alone. Eisenhower sat quietly, his face drawn, smoking, thinking. The room was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Minutes passed. Finally, he looked up. His words were simple. "I am quite positive we must give the order. I don't like it, but there it is. I don't see how we can do anything else." It was approximately 9:45 p.m. on June 4, 1944. Eisenhower had made his decision. The invasion would proceed on June 6. There would be one more weather briefing at 4 a.m. on June 5 to confirm, but unless something drastically changed, they were going. That decision made in the face of uncertainty, with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, was the decision that saved D-Day. It was not the only important decision Eisenhower made, but it was the most critical. Had he postponed again, waiting for the next tidal window 2 weeks later, the consequences could have been severe. The weather on June 19th, as it turned out, would bring the worst storm in the English Channel in decades, far worse than the conditions on June 6th. If the invasion had been scheduled for June 19th, it would certainly have been postponed again, and the whole timetable would have been thrown into chaos. Security might have been compromised. The alliance might have fractured. History would have been very different. At 4 a.m. on June 5th, the commanders reconvened. Stagg confirmed his forecast. The weather window still looked promising. Eisenhower polled his commanders again. There was no dissent. He gave the final order. "Okay, we'll go." With those words, the greatest military operation in history was set irrevocably in motion. Ships began sailing from ports all along the English coast. Paratroopers boarded their C-47 transport aircraft. Glider troops prepared to take off. Soldiers climbed down cargo nets into landing craft. The vast armada began moving toward Normandy. There was no turning back now. Eisenhower spent the evening of June 5 visiting troops. He went to the airfields where the 101st Airborne Division was preparing to take off. Photographs and film footage from that evening show him walking among the paratroopers, their faces blackened with camouflage paint, talking and joking with them, wishing them luck. He knew that many of them would not survive the night. The 101st was dropping into the area behind Utah Beach, and intelligence indicated heavy German defenses. Eisenhower feared that Leigh Mallory's pessimistic prediction might come true. One paratrooper asked Eisenhower where he was from. "Kansas," Eisenhower replied. "Oh," said the paratrooper, "that's where I'm from too." It was a small moment of human connection amid the immensity of what was about to happen. As darkness fell, the first aircraft took off, carrying paratroopers toward Normandy. Eisenhower watched them go, standing in the fading light, hands in his pockets. An aide later said that tears were in his eyes. He returned to his headquarters to wait. There was nothing more he could do. The decision had been made. The men were committed. Now it was up to them, and to fate. Eisenhower later said that the hours between the takeoff of the paratroopers and the first reports from Normandy were the longest of his life. The airborne assault began shortly after midnight on June 6. As Leigh Mallory had feared, it was chaotic. Cloud cover and German anti-aircraft fire scattered the formations. Paratroopers landed miles from their drop zones. Entire sticks of men were dropped into flooded areas and drowned, weighed down by their equipment. Gliders crashed. Units were fragmented. But the American and British paratroopers adapted. Small groups formed ad hoc units and moved toward their objectives. The very chaos of the drop confused the Germans, who received reports of landings across a wide area and could not determine where the main effort was focused. Key bridges were seized. Causeway exits from the beaches were secured. German reinforcements were delayed. Despite the disorder, the airborne operations achieved their essential goals. Meanwhile, the invasion fleet crossed the English Channel under cover of darkness. The rough seas that Stagg had warned about made the journey miserable. Thousands of soldiers were violently seasick. Landing craft bucked and heaved. Some men were so ill they could barely stand. Sailors fought to keep their vessels on course. But the fleet stayed together. The Germans, incredibly, did not detect it. The Luftwaffe was nearly absent from the skies. The Kriegsamarine's surface fleet was negligible. U-boats were held in port or engaged elsewhere. The vast armada approached the Normandy coast undetected. Surprise, the most precious commodity in warfare, remained intact. At dawn, naval guns opened fire. Thousands of shells pounded the German defences along the coast. The sound was like continuous thunder. Then came the bombers' wave after wave of Allied aircraft dropping their payloads on German positions. The Germans, many of whom had been asleep when the bombardment began, stumbled from their bunkers into chaos. At approximately 6:30 a.m., the first assault waves hit the beaches. On Utah Beach, the landing went relatively smoothly. Strong currents had pushed the landing craft south of their intended position. But by fortune, this area was less heavily defended. Troops moved inland quickly. By mid-morning, Utah Beach was secure. On Omaha Beach, the situation was very different. The landing was a nightmare. The pre-invasion bombardment had largely missed the German defenses. Most of the D.D. Sherman tanks sank in the rough seas. The German 352nd Infantry Division, which intelligence had not known was in the area, occupied strong positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach. As landing craft dropped their ramps, German machine guns and artillery opened fire. Men were cut down before they could reach the sand. The water turned red. Bodies floated in the surf. Landing craft burned. For a time it seemed the landing at Omaha might fail entirely. But the American soldiers, showing extraordinary courage, slowly fought their way forward. Small groups led by junior officers and NCOs found gaps in the German defences and pushed inland. By late morning, the crisis had passed. By evening, Omaha Beach was in Allied hands, though at a terrible cost. The British and Canadian Beaches Gold, Juno and Sword saw mixed results. German resistance varied. At some points the defenders fought fiercely, at others they surrendered quickly. Casualties were significant, but not catastrophic. By the end of June 6th, all 5 beaches were secured. Over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress Europe had been cracked open. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, but the battle was far from over. The Allies had gained a foothold, nothing more. The Germans still held all the major towns. Canton, which Montgomery had hoped to capture on the first day, remained in enemy hands and would not fall for weeks. The bocage country, the dense hedgerows of Normandy, proved to be a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The fighting ahead would be brutal, a grinding war of attrition lasting 2.5 months before the breakout at the end of August. But the critical fact was that the Allies were ashore and could not be dislodged. Eisenhower's decision had been vindicated. What made Eisenhower's decision so remarkable was not just that it was correct, but that it was made under such pressure with such incomplete information. He could not know for certain that Stagg's forecast was accurate. He could not know whether the weather window would hold. He could not know how the Germans would react, or whether the defenses at Omaha Beach were stronger than intelligence indicated. He was making a decision that would affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of men and the fate of nations, and he was making it in the dark, literally and figuratively, trusting his judgment, his commanders, and his weatherman. Moreover, Eisenhower understood something that many leaders do not, that inaction is also a decision, and often a more dangerous one than action. He could have postponed again, waiting for perfect conditions. But perfect conditions might never come. The tide tables would not wait. The Germans were strengthening their defenses every day. Delay meant risk of a different kind. The risk of losing the initiative, of compromising security, of political fallout. Eisenhower weighed all these factors and concluded that going forward, despite the risks, was less dangerous than waiting. That is the essence of command, making decisions with imperfect information, accepting responsibility for the outcome, and then committing fully to the course of action chosen. In the days following D-Day, as reports came in and the scope of the success became clear, Eisenhower received praise from all quarters. Churchill called it the greatest military operation in history. Roosevelt sent congratulations. Stalin, for once, was complimentary. But Eisenhower knew how close it had been. The weather had indeed improved, as Stagg predicted, but only barely. If the forecast had been wrong, if the storm had not abated, the result could have been catastrophic. Eisenhower carried the message he had written, accepting responsibility in case of failure. It read, "Our landings have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He never had to release that message, but he kept it as a reminder of what was at stake. Group Captain Stagg, the weatherman whose forecast made the decision possible, received little public recognition at the time. His work was classified. But after the war, Eisenhower personally thanked him and acknowledged the crucial role he had played. Stagg later wrote about the experience, describing the immense pressure of knowing that his forecast would influence Eisenhower's decision. He had been confident, but not certain. No meteorologist could be certain. Weather forecasting in 1944 was as much art as science. Stagg had trusted his instincts and his reading of the data, and he had been right. Had he been wrong, his name would be remembered very differently. The Germans, for their part, were caught completely by surprise. Rommel was in Germany on June 6, visiting his wife for her birthday. He had looked at the same weather reports and concluded that no invasion was possible in such conditions. Many other German commanders were away from their posts, attending a map exercise. The German response was slow and confused. Hitler, who had gone to bed late, was not awakened with news of the landings until mid-morning. Even then he refused to release the panzer reserves, believing the Normandy landings were a feint and that the real invasion would come at Calais. This hesitation cost the Germans their best chance to drive the Allies back into the sea. By the time Hitler realized his mistake and released the panzers, the Allies had consolidated their beachheads and brought ashore enough troops and equipment to hold. Eisenhower's decision on June 5, 1944, is studied today in military academies and business schools as a case study in leadership and decision-making under pressure. It illustrates several key principles. First, the importance of gathering the best information available, but recognizing that perfect information is rarely possible. Eisenhower consulted his meteorologists and his commanders, but ultimately he had to make the call with incomplete data. Second, the necessity of accepting responsibility. Eisenhower did not deflect blame or seek consensus to diffuse responsibility. He made the decision and accepted that if it went wrong, he alone would be accountable. Third, the courage to act. It would have been easier to postpone again, to wait for better conditions, but Eisenhower recognized that delay carried its own risks, and that sometimes the boldest course is the wisest. In the broader context of World War II, D-Day was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The successful establishment of a second front in the West meant that Germany was now fighting a two-front war it could not win. The Soviets were advancing from the east, slowly but inexorably pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Germany. The British and Americans were now advancing from the west. Germany's resources were stretched to the breaking point. The Luftwaffe was being ground down. The Kriegsmarine was irrelevant. German industry, despite the efforts of Armaments Minister Albert Speer, could not keep pace with Allied production. The war would continue for another 11 months, and there would be desperate battles ahead. Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. But after D-Day, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany would be defeated. The only question was when and at what cost. For Eisenhower personally, D-Day was his defining moment. He would go on to command Allied forces through the remainder of the war in Europe, accepting Germany's surrender in May 1945. After the war, he became Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, then President of Columbia University, then Supreme Commander of NATO. In 1952, he was elected President of the United States, serving 2 terms. Throughout his career, his reputation rested in part on his wartime leadership, and the centerpiece of that leadership was the decision he made on June 4, 1944. He was often asked about it. He always emphasized the collective effort, the bravery of the troops, the skill of his commanders. But everyone knew that the decision had been his, and his alone. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, have been rightly celebrated as heroes. Their courage under fire, their willingness to face death for a cause larger than themselves, their sacrifice, all of this has been memorialized in films, books, and monuments. The Normandy American Cemetery, overlooking Omaha Beach, contains the graves of over 9,000 American servicemen killed in the D-Day landings and the subsequent Battle of Normandy. Thousands more are buried in other cemeteries or were lost at sea. Every year on June 6, ceremonies are held to honor their memory. World leaders speak of their bravery. Veterans, now few in number, return to the beaches they stormed as young men. It is right that they are remembered. But it is also important to remember the decision that made their sacrifice meaningful. Without Eisenhower's decision to proceed on June 6, despite the marginal weather, there would have been no D-Day, at least not on that date. The invasion would have been delayed, perhaps, for weeks. The course of history would have been different. The men who died on the beaches of Normandy died because Eisenhower sent them there, knowing that many would not return. That is a heavy burden for any commander to bear. But Eisenhower bore it, as he bore all the burdens of command, with quiet dignity and an unwavering sense of duty. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote very little about the decision itself. He was not given to self-aggrandizement or detailed introspection about his own role. He described the weather briefings, the consultations with his commanders, and the decision to proceed, but he did so matter-of-factly, almost as if it had been routine. Perhaps for him, in a sense, it was routine. He had made thousands of decisions during the war, large and small. This one happened to be more consequential than most, but the process was the same: gather information, consult advisors, weigh the options, make the call, accept responsibility, move forward. That was command. Historians have debated many aspects of D-Day: whether the airborne drops were necessary, whether the naval bombardment was adequate, whether Montgomery's failure to capture Quezon on the first day was a significant setback, whether Eisenhower's broad front strategy was superior to Montgomery's narrow front proposal. These debates will continue, but there is no debate about the wisdom of Eisenhower's decision to proceed on June 6. With the benefit of hindsight, knowing that the weather window did indeed materialize and that the invasion succeeded, it is easy to say that it was the right decision. But Eisenhower did not have the benefit of hindsight. He had only his judgment, his experience, his advisors, and his willingness to accept responsibility. That he made the right call under such circumstances is a testament to his leadership. The counterfactual is worth considering. What if Eisenhower had postponed again? What if the invasion had been scheduled for June 19th and then postponed again because of the terrible storm? What if it had been delayed until July? The Germans would have had more time to strengthen their defenses. The Allies' elaborate deception would have been harder to maintain. The soldiers, keyed up for battle, would have had their morale sapped by repeated delays. The political pressure on Eisenhower would have been intense. Stalin would have been furious. Churchill and Roosevelt would have demanded explanations. The alliance might have been strained to the breaking point, and even if the invasion had eventually been launched, the Germans would have been more prepared, the defenses stronger, the casualties higher. It is possible, even likely, that a delayed invasion would still have succeeded. The Allies' material superiority was overwhelming, but the cost would have been greater, and the outcome less certain. There is also the personal dimension. Eisenhower was not a bloodless strategist, moving pins on a map without thought for the men they represented. He cared deeply about the soldiers under his command. His visits to the troops, his genuine interest in their welfare, his anguish over casualties, all of this was real. He knew that his decision would send men to their deaths. He knew that some of the paratroopers he spoke to on the evening of June 5 would be dead before dawn. He knew that on Omaha Beach, men would drown in the surf or be cut down by machine gun fire. He knew all of this, and he ordered the invasion to proceed anyway, because he believed it was necessary. That is the terrible burden of command in war, to accept that men will die because of your decisions, and to make those decisions anyway because the alternative is worse. In the end, Eisenhower's decision on June 4, 1944, saved D-Day not because it guaranteed success. Nothing could guarantee success in such a complex operation, but because it gave the invasion the best possible chance to succeed. The weather window, narrow as it was, proved sufficient. The surprise was maintained. The troops, despite rough seas and chaos, got ashore and stayed ashore. The Atlantic Wall was breached, and from that breach the Allied armies poured into France, beginning the liberation of Europe and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. All of this flowed from Eisenhower's decision to proceed despite the risks, to trust his weatherman's forecast, to trust his commanders, to trust his soldiers, and to accept the responsibility for the outcome. Today, more than 75 years after D-Day, we can look back and see the decision in its proper context. It was not the only important decision of the war. It was not even the only important decision Eisenhower made, but it was the decision that made D-Day possible. Without it, the largest amphibious invasion in history might not have happened when and how it did. The course of the war and of the 20th century would have been different. That a single decision made by one man in a rainy room on the English coast could have such far-reaching consequences is a reminder of the power and responsibility of leadership. Eisenhower understood that power and that responsibility. He did not seek glory. He did not claim credit. He simply did his duty, made the best decision he could with the information he had, and then lived with the consequences. That, ultimately, is what leadership is. The story of Eisenhower's decision is also a reminder that history is shaped not only by grand strategies and massive forces, but also by individual choices made in moments of crisis. The invasion of Normandy was the product of years of planning, involving millions of people and vast resources. But at the critical moment, it came down to one man's judgment. That judgment was informed by advisors, by data, by experience, but it was his alone. He could have chosen differently. He could have postponed. He could have waited. But he chose to go, and because he chose to go, D-Day happened. The war in Europe was won, and the world was changed. That is the power of decision. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of leadership and decision-making compelling, please subscribe to the channel and share this video. History is full of such times when individuals faced impossible choices and had to make decisions that would affect the lives of millions. Understanding these moments helps us understand not only the past, but also the nature of leadership, responsibility, and courage. Eisenhower's decision to proceed with D-Day on June 6, 1944, stands as one of the greatest examples of decision-making under pressure in military history. It was the decision that saved D-Day.